Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm James Menendez. Coming up, ordered to fire on anti-coup protesters, some Burmese police officers have fled to neighbouring India.
The military officer in charge ordered us to shoot at groups of more than 5 people. I had to desert the police department as I could not open fire on innocent people.
Other Burmese are trying to cross into Thailand. We'll hear from Bangkok about the authorities' efforts to block them. Also, 10 years after the start of the civil war, a new report highlights the heavy price paid by young Syrians.
The conflict started when they were 6 years old or 8 years old, and now they're in their early 20s, and all they can remember is bloodshed and losing family members.
Plus, the hundreds of opposition supporters in Uganda still missing 2 months after a disputed election. All of that and more coming up after the news.
Hello, I'm Moira Alderson with the BBC News. The military authorities in Myanmar have started expelling the families of railway workers from their state-owned housing in an attempt to break an indefinite general strike called by the main trades unions in protest at last month's coup. Hundreds of soldiers and police raided a railway workers' compound in Yangon as the security forces try to crush the civil disobedience movement. Here's Jonathan Head.
They, of course, are furious about this general strike of which the railway union is one of the key parts. They want to get people back to work, so they went in and said, if you won't work, you don't have anywhere to live. They've literally driven people out of their homes, and we saw people walking down the railway tracks carrying elderly relatives who couldn't walk and suitcases, and now there's an appeal out to try and find somewhere to put them because these people are saying they will not go back to work, they will not cooperate with this military regime.
Russia has started restricting the use of Twitter by slowing down the speed of the service. Twitter has been widely used by supporters of the jailed opposition activist Alexei Navalny. Shortly after the restrictions were announced, several official websites were briefly inaccessible. The BBC's Vitaly Shevchenko is monitoring developments.
Russia's media regulator said it was slowing down access to Twitter because it had failed to act on demands to remove illegal content, such as child pornography, calls to commit suicide or to use drugs. Shortly after this, Twitter users started to report problems with accessing photos and video content. And simultaneously, a number of government websites, including Kremlin.ru, the Parliament's website, and the media regulator's own website, went down.
South African police have fired rubber bullets and stun grenades to disperse students at the University of Witwatersrand who are demanding changes to registration and financial aid policies. One person was killed, but it's unclear if it was a student or passerby. The students have been protesting, blocking roads and causing general disruption over alleged financial exclusion by the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Poland has reported its highest daily number of new coronavirus cases in more than 3 months. It's registered more than 17,000 new infections and nearly 400 virus-related deaths. From Warsaw, Adam Easton reports.
Poland's third coronavirus wave is accelerating. In the past week, new daily infections have risen by 10% and deaths by almost 30%. In 2 northern provinces of Poland, with the highest growth in new cases, shopping centres, hotels, cinemas and sporting facilities have been or are being closed. New cases are expected to rise throughout the month, and officials have warned that households may have to spend Easter alone once again. Hungary's third wave is its most serious yet, with the number of new infections surpassing the previous peak in December.
World News from the BBC. Officials in Ethiopia say at least 22 people have been killed in a village in the region of Oromia. Some reports say they were shot in their homes. Others say they were taken from a church and shot in a forest. Another 20 people were kidnapped and later released. A local official said the gunmen were members of the rebel Oromo Liberation Army. A Tanzanian opposition leader has called for the government to reveal the whereabouts of President John Magufuli. He has not been seen in public for a fortnight. Here's Mary Harper.
Tanzania's main opposition leader, Tundu Lissu, said the president's well-being was a matter of grave public concern. He said people had been told about the illnesses of former Tanzanian presidents and that they deserved to know about Mr. Magufuli. The Tanzanian government has warned the media against reporting unverified information about the president's health. A leading Kenyan newspaper is reporting that an African leader is in a Nairobi hospital, but this has not been confirmed. Mr. Magufuli has downplayed the threat of coronavirus. He says people should pray and use steam inhalation instead of having vaccines. Tanzania has not published COVID-19 data since May last year.
President Biden's huge stimulus package for the American economy looks set to clear all legislative hurdles when the House of Representatives votes on the $1.9 trillion measure shortly. The Democrats, who narrowly control the House and the Senate, say the package is a vital response to rejuvenate an economy scarred by the pandemic, which has killed more than 500,000 Americans. Washington has announced that the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will visit Japan and South Korea next week, his first foreign trip since taking up the post. Mr. Blinken will be accompanied by the Defence Secretary, Lloyd Austin. That's the latest. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. I'm James Menendez. And our top story today is those fleeing the military coup in Myanmar. In part, it's people who fear the risk of arrest and want to get out of the country as soon as they can. But it's also those tasked with enforcing the will of the military authorities and don't want to be a part of the crackdown. Today in the main city, Yangon, police and soldiers moved in to break up a strike by rail workers by forcing them out of their state-owned housing at gunpoint. Well, in a few minutes' time, we'll hear about the situation on the border between Myanmar and Thailand, where refugees are being turned away. But first to the country's border with India and the state of Mizoram in the northeast, across which a number of Burmese have fled, including police officers. The BBC's Rajini Vaidyanathan is there. Rajini, what have they told you?
So, we've been told by officials that as many as 130 people have crossed the border from Myanmar over to India. And I met more than a dozen police officers who say that the reason that they fled is because they were asked by their superiors to carry out orders which included shooting at crowds to disperse protests. Now, the people that I spoke to didn't come from Yangon. They came from a number of different cities in Myanmar, and they say that that's a sign that the protests are intensifying across the country. Here's the voice of one such person that I spoke to who said what he was asked to do by his bosses.
The military officer in charge ordered us to shoot at groups of more than 5 people. They said they would take the responsibility for that. I had to desert the police department as I could not open fire on innocent people.
And Rajini, is there any way to check what they're saying? Were their accounts all similar?
Yeah, one thing we did, first of all, for example, is actually to check that they were police officers, and we saw photographs of them in their uniform and their national IDs. Some said that they came in groups as well. I spoke to one man who said he came in a wave of 6 people. We met 2 groups in 2 different cities, or 2 different towns, I should say, in this state of Mizoram. Obviously, for their safety, we're not naming who the officers are, and we're not saying where we met them. But certainly their accounts do seem quite similar, although of course we're unable to independently verify the claims they are making. But it is a similar narrative. They say that they believe that the military is giving orders to the police. In particular, they say that they're being asked to disperse protesters. One person that we spoke to said that he went out in pairs with a member of the military, and they were told that anyone who was banging utensils as part of a peaceful protest was threatened with arrest. In some cases, they were actually arresting people, and in other cases, there were instances with a number of people that we spoke to who said that they were asked to actually shoot at the crowds. And of course, as we know, we're hearing from inside the country more and more reports of an increased military crackdown as that coup continues.
And Virginia, what's going to happen to those who have come across the border?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, one thing that I should start by saying, James, is that we're hearing from groups who are connected to people who are in Myanmar that they're expecting more people to come across. In fact, yesterday, a conversation I had with somebody said that he was expecting another 3 to 5 police men and women to cross over. So there is the anticipation that more people will come. Now, one official in Myanmar wrote to the authorities in India asking that the police men and women who are here be sent back. Now, the Chief Minister of the state of Mizoram, from where I'm speaking, said that at least for now, those who are taking refuge in this state should be given food and shelter. But at the moment, we still haven't heard from the national government about what exactly they are going to do. And I've been down to the border. It's a river that separates Mizoram from Myanmar. So it's quite a porous border, and it's fairly easy, it seems, for people to be able to do that crossing. So we are potentially in a situation where the Indian government's yet to comment on what it's going to do, but we are expecting that more people will make that journey as the crackdown continues in Myanmar.
Rajini, many thanks. So the BBC's Rajini Vaidyanathan on the Myanmar-India border. Well, let's head almost due east from there, 1,800 kilometres away to the border between Myanmar and Thailand. What impact is the coup and its aftermath having there? Sunai Pasuk is a researcher for Human Rights Watch in Bangkok.
This is a worrying situation because the border has been closed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Thai security agencies along the border have been using COVID-19 as a convenient excuse to turn around anyone trying to cross the border and deny them access to the UN Refugee Agency screening mechanism. So people have been sent back immediately without having a chance to ask for protection.
Yeah, so just to be clear, there have been actual cases, examples of the Thai authorities turning people away at the border. Is that right?
The most recent case that Human Rights Watch is aware of just happened on the 7th of March. A group of 8 people crossed the border. They were intercepted by Thai army soldiers and sent back immediately. The soldiers simply said that those people had to be sent back because they could spread COVID virus, as simple as that.
What are Thailand's obligations? I mean, my understanding is that it never ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention. So can it argue that it doesn't have to consider any asylum applications?
Even though Thailand is not a party to the Refugee Convention, beyond that, Thailand has a long history of providing sanctuary for asylum seekers, either those from Myanmar or from Indochina, Laos, Vietnam or Cambodia. The refugee camps that used to exist or still exist in Thailand reflect the fact that Thailand can fulfill its customary obligation to protect refugees when it wanted to. Yeah. The question is, what is the position of Thailand now?
And is that complicated by the fact that it's not really quite clear what Thailand makes of the coup in Myanmar? And of course, Thailand is led by people who led their own coup in Thailand.
Indeed, Thailand is among one of those few countries who, up until now, refused to call what happened in Myanmar on the 1st of February a military coup. Thailand has not raised any concerns, not a single word. So the position of Thailand is clearly siding with military dictatorship in Myanmar. It is clear that the Thai government of General Prayut Chan-o-cha, who is personally a close friend of Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, will try to enforce more and more restrictive measures to prevent Myanmar people who live in Thailand from raising their voice, from demanding democracy, from condemning the killings that's going on right now in Myanmar.
And also, am I right in thinking, I mean, there are tens of thousands of refugees from Myanmar already in Thailand, and many of those came over in the 1980s. Am I right in thinking that the repatriation program for them has stopped at the moment?
That is true. Late last year, around November, December, hopes were very high that the chance for camp population to return home to a better future was very near. People were very hopeful, but then a coup happened on the 1st of February that has taken away the opportunity for refugees from Myanmar who live in Thailand for decades. Some were born in the camps to be able to return home safely. There's no more hope.
Sonai Pathak of Human Rights Watch in Bangkok. The numbers of COVID patients in hospital and on ventilators continues to fall in the United Kingdom, one of the worst hit countries in the world. But at the same time, the burden of those with chronic health problems post-infection continues to rise. It's not known exactly how many people in the UK have long COVID, an umbrella term for a huge variety of symptoms affecting different parts of the body. The BBC's medical editor, Fergus Walsh, has been to see one patient who was critically ill with COVID in the first wave nearly a year ago.
I'm feeling tired. All right, okay.
Surviving intensive care is just the beginning of a patient's recovery from COVID.
And my chances were, I think, very, very low.
Jake, we're going to have a little roll over to the other side now.
Jake Vujovic, who's 56, spent 3 weeks on a ventilator in April last year. And when we met in May, he still had a tracheostomy, an opening in his windpipe. He was just beginning physio at London's University College Hospital and was so weak it took 4 people to get him into a chair.
I'm not going to give up. Not a chance. I was given a chance and I'm not going to waste it.
Now, 10 months on, his continues and includes weight training at the family home in North London. In all, Jake spent 107 days in hospital. COVID can cause a huge variety of symptoms, often triggered by an overreaction of the body's own immune system.
My feet are still paralyzed. I can't go anywhere without crutches. It's quite risky. As far as my lungs are concerned, there is an enormous limit. If I just sit on an exercise bike, for example, I can't do even the basic exercise longer than 2 minutes. The other thing, which is still remains as a fatigue, it just hits you from nowhere. It's all so unpredictable.
Jake has been spared the brain fog, the cognitive problems which many long COVID patients experience. He's back working a couple of hours a day and keeping in regular contact with the rehab team at UCH via video calls.
You were saying that you were returning to work. How's that been for you this week?
Fatigue is still here.
Alice Nicholson is an occupational therapist working with COVID patients.
Post-viral fatigue is like nothing we've ever seen before. You think people are going to really improve and get over fatigue really very quickly, but they don't at all. Actually seeing them with such long-term disabilities, an effect of that is, it's awful, it's harrowing.
Jake's wife Natasha and 18-year-old daughter Emily were unable to see him in hospital due to COVID restrictions, which made the waiting at home all the more challenging. Now he's back, Natasha says they count their blessings.
Just the fact that he's next to me, that we are sitting next together and talking, and Emily has a father, and that we are family again, I think that's the best of everything.
That report by our medical editor, Fergus Walsh. You're listening to News Hour from the BBC World Service. Still to come on the programme, we'll talk to the former Hong Kong lawmaker Ted Hui, who fled the territory after he was charged with taking part in pro-democracy protests. He's now been allowed to stay in Australia. He tells us he hopes it won't be permanent.
I might not be able to go home for the rest of my life, but as long as we fight hard enough inside Hong Kong and outside Hong Kong, we all join hands together with the help of leaders of free nations, it's a possibility that we will be able to go home after the regime has been removed. You never know.
That interview coming up in a few minutes' time. Our top headline this hour from the newsroom: Myanmar security forces have begun evicting railway workers from their homes in an attempt to break a general strike against the coup. This is James Menendez with NewsHour live from the BBC. Now, the governor of the US state of Arkansas has signed into law an act banning all abortions except when the woman's life is in danger. It's the latest state to tighten restrictions, part of a campaign by anti-abortion activists to challenge the nationwide legalization enshrined in the 1973 Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. Their hopes have been raised by the appointment of 3 conservative judges to the court by former President Trump. Let's talk to Mary Ziegler, who's Professor of Law at Florida State University and the author of Abortion and the Law in America, Roe v. Wade to the Present. Mary, welcome to the programme. First of all, this move by the state of Arkansas, I mean, is it constitutional?
Well, no, not under current law, but that's the point. Arkansas, really in the opening sentence of the law, argues that this is a bid to overturn Roe v. Wade and the cases that have followed it. So it's designed to be unconstitutional, to sort of force the hand of the court's current 6-justice majority.
And so how would that process happen then?
Well, we would expect that the law will probably never go into effect before it's blocked by a lower court, and it would take probably the better part of 3 years to make it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court is under no obligation to take any case involving an abortion law. So Arkansas is gambling probably quite a bit of taxpayer money that this will be the law that the court chooses to take to ultimately put an end to Roe v. Wade.
And other states are trying, Republicans in other states are trying to do similar things, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are about a dozen states that have passed what are called heartbeat laws that ban abortion when fetal cardiac activity or a heartbeat can be detected roughly between the 6th and 8th week of pregnancy. There are states like Alabama has introduced a law similar to Arkansas's that ban more or less all abortions. Other states have tried a more incremental approach. I think you can divide Republican states into 2 camps that way. For example, focusing on medication abortion, which will likely prove to be crucial in a post-Roe world, just as it has in Poland. States focusing, for example, on later abortions, which tend to be less popular with the American public. So those states are all wagering that the U.S. Supreme Court won't want to go for a kind of quick strike on Roe and will want a more kind of gradual buildup, more of a death of 1,000 cuts, if you will, because quite simply, otherwise it would make the court look partisan, right? If you add 3 new justices and the law changes radically in the matter of a year, that makes the court look more like a political institution than a judicial one.
Am I right in thinking that the Supreme Court has an abortion case before it, but it doesn't seem particularly keen to take it on? Is that right?
Yeah, the court isn't particularly keen to really say anything one way or another. So this case, Dobbs, involves a Mississippi law banning abortion at 15 weeks, and the court has been sitting on it since October without deciding one way or another whether to take it. And so that would suggest that Arkansas lawmakers may have misread the court a little bit. The court certainly doesn't seem to be in a hurry. And we quite simply don't know what kind of conservative the 3 new justices that former President Trump nominated, what kind of conservative they are. So we know there are some conservatives like Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas who are ready to overturn Roe v. Wade tomorrow. We also know there are others like Chief Justice John Roberts who seem worried about the court's institutional legitimacy and want to move more slowly. And we don't know where the other 3 will fall. And so it may be that the end for Roe will come in a matter of years, not a matter of months, and that the process will be much more stealthy and gradual than Arkansas lawmakers may have anticipated.
And to what extent are those Republican lawmakers in states like Arkansas reflecting public opinion in those states?
Well, they're not really. I mean, even in very conservative states, voters, for example, favor exceptions in cases of rape and incest, often want abortion to be legal early, if not later in pregnancy. And so this is a reflection of the kind of new politics of the Republican Party in the United States, which is really about rallying the base or energizing your most passionate supporters, not playing to those in the middle, who in the United States, as in much of Europe, have kind of more conflicted views views about abortion where they want it to be legal but regulated, and particularly more accessible early in pregnancy rather than later. But Arkansas lawmakers are clearly not concerned with those voting majorities. They're concerned with the people who care the most about abortion, who tend to have, really on the pro-choice or pro-life side, tend to have more extreme preferences.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Mary Ziegler, Professor of Law at Florida State University. To Hong Kong now, where the adoption of a new national security law last year has severely restricted people's ability to criticise Beijing and to speak out in favour of democracy for the territory. It's also led to nearly 50 pro-democracy activists being charged with subversion under the legislation for organising an unofficial primary election. That in turn has led other activists and politicians to believe it's too dangerous to stay. Some prominent voices have fled to the UK and North America. The former Democratic Party lawmaker Ted Hui has just arrived in Australia after Canberra gave him an exemption to COVID border restrictions and a temporary visa. He's currently in quarantine. I spoke to him a little earlier and asked him, why Australia?
I want Hong Kongers' voice to be heard in this part of the world. Hong Kongers has experienced police brutality, and now many of us activists and politicians facing jail time for decades and years just for fighting for democracy and freedoms. I spent 3 months in the UK, but in this part of the globe, I feel I'm more needed.
So it's about spreading the sort of exile voice around the world. And what is it you want the Australian government in particular to do to help people like yourselves who are still in Hong Kong?
The frontline protesters, for example, they will need a safe place to go to leave Hong Kong from the terror of CCP. So I'll be grateful for the help of the Australian government in receiving them.
Is it possible that people may soon not be able to leave at all? I mean, the Hong Kong government has talked about giving the Immigration Department unfettered powers to stop people leaving. So I guess it may be that, you know, even if a government like Australia's government puts in some sort of scheme to make it easier for people to come to Australia, they may be...